So the last seam finish I'm going to show you is the serged seam finish. This is one of the most common types of seam finishes, and it's one of the fastest seam finishes to create. The reason I'm showing it to you last is because it requires more than one sewing machine to complete it. I'm going to use the 2 remaining 1/2 inch seam allowance patterns cut from muslin. I've got 2 pieces here with my internal lines transferred. It's a little hard to see on this one, but I also have it on this one. I've also got my notches clipped at the top and bottom. So these 2 pieces are ready to go. And just as we've done before, I'm going to place both pieces together. Make sure my notches are aligned. Pin perpendicular to my stitching line. So I'm pinned, I'm ready to go, pinned through all layers. I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine and sew at my 1/2 inch seam allowance, back tacking at the beginning and back tacking at the end of my seam. Raising my presser foot, putting my work in, back tack at the beginning. Stitch all the way through. And back tack at the end. Make sure my take-up lever is all the way up. Raise my presser foot, release my work, clip my threads. Got another seam. 2 sides sewn together. Take this to the iron and press it flat. Pressing my seam open. Making sure it's nice and flat on the front and back of the sample. Now, I've got another seam to clean finish. I'm going to go to my serger. I'm going to isolate one of my seam allowances, just like I've done before, pinch just the seam allowance and slide everything else out to the left-hand side. So I just have the seam allowance here, and I'm going to go to my serger to clean finish this edge. So here at my serger, I've isolated my rightmost seam allowance. I just pinched my rightmost seam allowance and tucked everything else underneath to the left-hand side of my sample. And I'm going to serge along this raw edge, my rightmost seam allowance. Now, in the introductory video that explained overlock sergers, there is, as stated in that video, a blade built into every serger machine, including my home serger here. This piece of metal, this vertical piece of metal here, slides and oscillates up against another piece of metal built into the needle plate on my serger. And those 2 pieces of metal sliding back and forth between each other creates a scissor-like oscillation that will cut off any of the little raw edges, any fibers that are left over on my fabric. Now, because it will cut your fabric, you want to make sure that you're careful about the placement of your fabric when you place it into the serger, so you can avoid cutting off too much of your seam allowance. We just wanted to trim any of the little extra pieces along the edge there. So I'm going to place my work into my serger. I'm lifting my presser foot, just as we've done on the lock stitch machine. You will have a pedal at the bottom of your machine that will raise the presser foot. I have a lever in the back of my serger. So I've raised my presser foot. I'm placing my fabric inside of that, underneath that presser foot, and then lowering it. And if I can zoom in here, I'll show you. There is that piece of metal I mentioned, and you can see right in here is the raw edge of my fabric right up against the leftmost edge of this piece of metal. So I'm lining this up right along the leftmost edge of this piece of metal to avoid cutting too much of my fabric off. You'll notice I have a tail of threads. There should be a tail of threads on the machine already, left over from when the last person was sewing on it. With an overlock machine, including sergers, you will start sewing. You'll sew the length of your desired seam, and when you get to the end of the seam allowance, you will continue to sew. There is no back tacking on an overlock machine. You will continue to sew and continue to sew off of the machine so that you leave another tail behind for the next round of sewing. I'm going to go ahead and sew. This might be a little bit loud on the recording, but I'm going to do my best to keep my fabric aligned to this leftmost edge of my blade so that I don't cut anything off. Now I'm getting near the end of my work. There is a hand wheel on every serger. Again, you can turn that hand wheel towards you, so if you feel that the serger is running too fast, you can walk your stitches. Again, always turning the hand wheel towards you, towards the user. As I get near the end of my work, I'm going to continue sewing and pull my work as I go so that the threads don't get caught up inside of the machine. Sorry for the shaky footage there, but you can see I continue to sew, and there's another chain of fabric caught on my machine. I'm going to cut these thread tails. And grab my snips and cut that so I have a little bit of thread left on my sample on both ends, and so I keep a thread tail on my machine. I'm going to go ahead and snip these thread tails off on my sample. There are multiple methods for clean finishing the threads on your serged samples. Just for this particular sample, we'll keep it simple and just cut those threads off. And now I'm going to take care of the other side of my seam. I'm going to again pinch this and isolate it, turn all of my other fabric to the rightmost side of my sample. There we go. So now I've isolated the left seam allowance. I'm going to turn my work around because unlike on the lock stitch machine, you have to make sure that all of your excess fabric is going to your left. You do not want any excess fabric going to the right of a serger machine because it'll get cut by the blade. So I'm going to turn my work around. Always make sure your raw edge is to the rightmost side of where you're working. Raise the presser foot. Place my work inside of there, lower my foot, and again you can see where the leftmost edge of my blade is giving me a guideline for where to align the raw edge of my fabric, and I'll go ahead and serge down this edge. To the end of my work, I'm going to continue stitching, and you'll see me pull my work away so the threads don't get caught in the machine. So now I've got some thread tails. I'm just going to clip these close to my work and clip these threads at the beginning. So that's 2 edges serged. Gotta change the tension. on my machine. This is looping a little bit too much for my taste. I've got to adjust the tension on my machine. But I have 2 raw edges, clean finished with serge stitching. Serge stitching is a great way to prevent your fabric from fraying or producing holes over time. It lasts for a very long time, and as you can see, as long as you have a serging machine, it's very fast and very easy to do. So here is my serged seam finish. I'm going to label it as such. The important thing with doing the serge seam finish on a garment is to ensure that you isolate your seam allowance, because if any of your garment fabric gets caught in the serger, it will get cut and you will end up with a hole in your work. You can hit this with the iron one more time if you feel like the stitching has buckled up a little bit. You can get onto the iron and press it nice and flat, and that is the serged seam finish.